Hello Internet, and welcome to another episode of Experimental Cataclysm, the show where we talk about recent changes to the experimental version of Cataclysm Dark Days Ahead. Now I have a few updates to things that we talked about previously, but the show overall is a little lighter than the last couple. Now I do want to say up front, I recently had some dental work, so I may sound a little bit different. I don't really think that I do, but you listen to my voice frequently enough that you may notice a little bit of a change. Alright, so first up, the updates. You may remember a few weeks ago we talked about helmets now having a pocket for flashlights. Unfortunately, there was a bit of a minor issue, and they could not accommodate flashlights if they were using a light battery. Well, Cass Wedson saw this and fixed it. It's a really minor fix, it's very easy. I had already planned that whoever fixed this would get a shout out, so there you go. Now the other update this week is related to beehives. You may remember that they were spawning incredibly frequently, sometimes leading to you having 5 or 6 of them in a single forest tile. Well, this has now been addressed by Fairy Armadillo. In addition to reducing their frequency pretty significantly, it also somewhat lowers the amount of wax and honey that are obtained when you smash or harvest the beehives. Now honestly, this is a little bit of a complicated thing to balance. Honey has a lot of calories per gram in real life, and realistically, harvesting a beehive would net you a lot of calories. Now more or less, I view this the same way that I view cows and milk in the game currently. Without some way of requiring the player to have a balanced diet, there will be people who exist solely on that one overpowered food source. Realistically, cows produce a lot of milk just as beehives have a lot of calories, and there's no easy way for us to balance those numbers until they fit with the game without also making it seriously unrealistic. So yeah, I don't have answers to these things, but I think that this PR has done a lot to help rein in the problems that we discussed previously. Now moving on to new changes here, next up from Ruminator24, we've got a smartwatch item. Now this is a smartwatch. These exist in real life, and they have basically some of the same functionality found in smartphones or on the fitness tracker. It comes with the options to track your calories, use the camera, track your overall health information, or play music. Now you're probably familiar with the calorie tracking and the heart rate thing, and I've never used the camera in the game until I was testing this change. I remember the photo stuff was added, I just have always viewed it as a novelty and never really bothered with it. Anyway, the thing I wanted to point out here is that the music function of the smartwatch does not seem to be working properly. Using the option drains the battery and prints a message saying that you are starting to listen to music, but you are not actually doing that. Normally, let's say you use your smartphone for this, when you start playing music, messages will begin printing in the log to describe what music you're hearing. The item also transforms so that you can turn off that music by activating the smartphone again. Now unfortunately for the smartwatch, the music never actually starts playing, so you don't get the mood buff or the messages in the log, and you can't deactivate that function by using the watch again. Now that's really the only thing of note or bug thing that I found related to this. Now I have no issues with smartwatches being added to the game, although I personally would probably not use them. I would just use a smartphone instead. They are ultimately more common, and they can just be shoved in my backpack and never thought of again until I actually need them. Next up today from a noob in disguise, we've got a Bionic Radio. Normally, if you gave your NPC a two-way radio and you carried one on your person, you could then use it to communicate with that NPC. Now I don't believe I've ever used these. I'm really not a fan of NPC companions in any game ever, so I'm not 100% on what all dialogue options are available. I assume you get the same options that you would if you attempt to chat with them when they're very close to your character. Anyway, to do this, you would be required to carry your radio on your person in order to communicate with them in that way. This PR makes it so that instead you could install the InfoLink Bionic in order to function as your radio, so you don't have to carry one. Now it's not exactly an enormously valuable Bionic, but hey, we almost never get new Bionics, so let's just be glad that they were expanded in any way. Next up today from Ty Gamble, we've got the addition of a makeshift pressure cooker. I really only mention this because I recall people talking about this several months ago, wanting a makeshift pressure cooker. I seem to recall that people pointed out that pots not designed to be a pressure cooker would not be suitable to craft a makeshift pressure vessel. So I do find it a bit odd that this random stock pot is able to hold up to being put under pressure. I own a stock pot myself, and there's no way it could be used as a pressure vessel. And worse still, you can craft your own stock pot with just using welding and a single piece of sheet metal. Now I don't know how thick a sheet metal is supposed to be, but this seems just wildly dangerous to me personally. And like, I know that weld points can be made very strong and everything, but I would think that for a pressure cooker you would want a seamless non-welded pot. So yeah, I think this overall is a little odd, but I'm not a welder or anything, and I've never made my own pressure cooker, so I don't know. Now this stuff doesn't really make sense to me personally, but I'm gonna defer to people who would know better than I do. I'm sure that there are plenty of people who, as soon as this comes up, they would go to YouTube and they would find, of course, videos of people making their own pressure cookers, and I just don't really have the experience to comment. Anyway, this thing is craftable now, so if you want a makeshift pressure cooker, you now have the option to make one. Next up today from Rennick CDDA, we've got the addition of snares for small creatures. These existed previously in a mod, but that mod was then obsoleted and it was never added to vanilla, it just sort of disappeared. Well, now you can craft snares, you can deploy them as traps and contain small animals within them. Now this only works for creatures that are small or tiny, so you are limited to things like rabbits and squirrels and birds and things like that. Creatures in the snare have a chance to break out every second, and this is based on their melee dice rolls. So for example, using a rabbit, their dice is 0d0, so they are basically stuck there forever. Now according to a comment in the PR, the maximum here would be 100 turns later, or approximately 3 hours for struggling for most creatures. I don't really understand this comment. 100 turns presumably means 100 seconds, which is nowhere near 3 hours. And if a snare only lasted for 100 seconds, then I would view this as completely useless. In my testing, the rabbit was trapped indefinitely. It never was released from the trap, so that comment just sort of confused me on how it's supposed to work. And when I tested it with cats, cats escaped essentially immediately from the trap, nowhere near 3 hours that was mentioned. I don't really understand these snares. However, I have no real issue with this existing in the game, but I do find them extremely limited in their usefulness. The only way I could find to trap animals was to create a big line of traps and then position myself so that the animal retreated away from me and into the trap. And since animals have such large sight radiuses and they move so erratically and so quickly, I can't really think of an instance where I would want to use this item. It does work on cats, so maybe if you were trying to tame a cat, I would do this, but they only stayed in the trap for like 8 seconds, so I just don't really get it. I think the concept of a snare in general in a game like this is usually used in conjunction with hunting. You set a bunch of snares in the forest, then you come back in a day or two and see if you caught anything. Unfortunately, this sort of snare would not work in Cataclysm because of the reality bubble, and because any larger creature would break out in less than a minute. So cats, for example, as I said, they break out very quickly. They would have a 17% chance to break out every single second. So I don't really understand the point of these snares, and I don't need to keep going on about it. I just think these are extremely limited in their value, and they do not work the way that most of us would want them to. In other words, you can't just set them and forget them and then return later to check if you had caught small game. I have no problem with them existing, I just also suspect that we're going to have people confused because they don't work the way we would expect them to. Anyway, next up today from A Noob in Disguise, we've got an overall buff to Survivor Zombie loot. I believe we talked about this in the most recent show. Basically, Survivor Zombies are supposed to be characters like the player who died later and became zombies. So the idea is that they had geared up and were surviving the apocalypse until they were finally brought down by the undead and themselves became zombies. Unfortunately, their loot has always been pretty terrible. It never really reflected their survivor status, as they usually just dropped plain clothing and essentially nothing of value. Now, this was much worse back in the day when they were one of the tougher enemies that you could encounter on day one, and loot in general back then was a lot stingier. It's been less of an issue in recent years because they were significantly less common, and since we encountered them less, it was less obvious how bad they were. Anyway, this PR sought to give them better loot in general. This primarily improved their armor overall, including different protections for each body part. This includes helmets and gas masks as well. Most of the armor they drop seemed to be a mix of low-tier, player-craftable items like 2x shins or the recently added carpet armor. And I love the idea of these characters being zombie versions of the player, reflecting that they're using the same crafting recipes that we would use in order to outfit themselves. In the comments, it was pointed out that this is quite a lot of gear to be dropping from these enemies. Now, I am inclined to agree just to some extent. Now, initially, I didn't really think they were overgeared, but the tools are the thing that got me. Basically, I noticed in one of the screenshots there was a hexamine stove and some board games, things like that, dropping from these zombies. And ideally, those sort of things would spawn more in locations and not really on a person's inventory. So you would expect to find these things more where the survivor had been staying and not in their actual inventory. Like, I was thinking, like, how can we emulate the player's standard loadout but also balance it with damaged gear to where it feels like you truly just stumbled on a zombie player character? This doesn't particularly bother me though, because one, players do loot locations and have to carry that stuff back to base. So it could be argued that this zombie is just coming back from a supply run when it died. And once again, people often argue about dropping backpacks and weapons and things like that, but again, we don't find those things on the ground, so I don't know that that really matters here. And then two, because these are sufficiently rare enemies, I'm not really bothered by this. I genuinely don't really have an idea of how common they are nowadays. I never seem to find them anymore. When I first started playing years ago, they were very common, and many locations intentionally spawned survivor zombies over our standard zombies to give a place more character. In other words, if you made a bunker type location for the game, you would manually spawn survivors there to show that they had existed in that bunker. And a lot of those individual manually placed spawns have been reduced over the years in favor of spawning from groups of monsters instead. We also have more enemies in general than when I first started playing, which really diluted the spawn of the non-standard zombie types. Anyway, the point is, I don't really see anything obviously wrong with these creatures and their new loot. If someone nerfed their spawns a little bit, I wouldn't bat an eyelash because it is pretty generous at the moment. But for the reasons I listed previously, I think this is a net positive change. These survivors had just terrible loot before. Next up today from Kitty Tack, we have an all-around buff to claw mutations. These are now integrated weapons, although I don't really know how they were handled previously. I thought they were integrated weapons, apparently not. Now, I'm not really equipped to talk about this change other than to say that it was a buff overall. In the description, it says that the point of balancing for their damage was based around a kitchen knife. And while I don't think that most claws would be comparable to a kitchen knife in terms of damage, there aren't humans with claws, so I have no idea really. The thing that stood out to me in this PR is that several of the claws now have butchering qualities, and some, like the talons, actually have the fine cutting quality. This means these would be integrated parts of the player that can be used for dissection. Now, initially I found this pretty strange, but it is only fine cutting one, which it can be used for dissection, but it's not very good. And since they're treated as fingernails, you would have enough decent manipulation for a task like dissection, I guess. I find it very odd to think that the player is quartering or skinning a creature with a finger claw, but again, whatever, I don't know. I just thought I would mention all of this because it now provides a mutation alternative to some extent for the surgical scalpel CBM. As far as I know, until now, there was no way to dissect using a mutation. It's nowhere near as good as the surgical scalpel CBM, but since mutations and bionics are becoming mutually exclusive, it makes sense to have a mutation alternative. Now, hopefully all that made sense. Like I said, I'm not super educated when it comes to mutations and I don't think I've ever used the previous claw mutations that I can recall. I feel like I've tried the, Bionic claws? I've definitely used those. I don't think I've used the mutation version. Anyway, moving along, next up today from Fatigue Dev, we've got a quick menu for NPC interactions. Previously, if you wanted to instruct an NPC to do something, you would have to navigate through the conversation menu and tell them what to do. Now, this did take a long time as there were quite a few commands here, and most of them were buried in a tree of dialogue. And if you messed up, let's say you didn't have a certain zone set up so the NPC couldn't do their job, you would have to go all the way back through those menus again after you fixed your mistake. Well, anyway, this PR makes it so that if you press the capital C key by default, which is the command that usually tells your character, like lets them think or yell or etc. Well, if you press this key, you now will have access to a quick menu for those commands. This option will only appear if you have an NPC follower, so it doesn't clutter the menu when no one is around. You will select the option Tell Someone to Work On, and then you will see a list of possible options. For example, you could instruct an NPC to butcher corpses. This will have them check for zones with corpses, they will grab butchering tools, and they will begin butchering. So yeah, pretty straightforward really. Those of you who do a lot with NPCs probably recognize the value of this immediately. I think this is a great change overall, and I saw no issues with it. Next up today from B. Dennis Sir, we've got the addition of Turkish foods and their recipes, as well as a cookbook for those recipes. Now that I'm looking at this, someone hit this with a thumbs down. Why would you it's food. They're food recipes. I don't understand what the problem is here. Anyway, this adds a variety of Turkish foods, none of which I recognize except for the delicious baklava. I'm an ignorant American. I eat garbage food that can be microwaved. I apologize for my ignorance. The book of recipes is appropriately named the Turkish Cookbook. I don't really have opinions on this. The thumbs down threw me a little bit. No idea why people would have a problem with random food items being added to the game. I don't think it's very much clutter. They are in a book recipe, so you could just dump the book away from you and you wouldn't have to see those recipes if you didn't want to. Unless it's an issue with Turkey itself, which is like, I mean, politically, I guess, well, it doesn't matter. Anyway, Turkish foods, hooray. Anyway, moving on. Next up today from Dave to 2700, we have a new upgrade for Shady Zombies, the Zombie Prowler. Like the other Shady Zombies, this one does have the ability to disappear in shadow. Shadies in general are not very common today, and their only upgrade previously, other than pupating zombies, was the Night Stalker. I'm really not a fan of the Night Stalker. I feel like their throat cut ability is nonsense and very powerful. But anyway, that has no bearing on this PR. Anyway, the Zombie Prowler is an upgrade for the Shady, which is an alternative to the possible Night Stalker evolution. It sees poorly in the daylight and extraordinarily well at night, just like the other Shady Zombies. It can bite and scratch the player, it has decent damage dice, and a really obnoxious grab attack that can pull your character to a new tile. They have a dodge of 7 as well, which I in general dislike enemies with a high dodge, but there's not really anything wrong with it. Now, unlike the Night Prowler, it does not have that brutal throat cut ability or the brute smash ability either, which in my opinion makes this variation a whole lot less obnoxious. Now, they do have a special ability called Impale, which I thought was the one that knocks you to the ground, but in testing it didn't do that, so I'm not really sure what Impale does here. Other than that, I don't really have thoughts on it. Seems totally fine to me, unless I miss some glaring issue. And then finally today from Carol, we've got an update to the child items and notes that we discussed previously. The initial PR, if you don't remember, it added a bunch of child-related survivor notes and addressed many of the issues with the drop tables for child zombies. And this PR is a continuation of that. First of all, it removed a few additional spawns from those child zombies. For example, they should no longer spawn with corsets or nano skirts, which doesn't really fit them. It also removed some books that don't really fit for children, such as the Catalytic Reactor book. And you can tell that's not a child book because I'm a grown-ass man and I have no idea what that book is for. Now, in general, these changes all make sense to me and continue to bring their loot in line with a younger child. Now, we discussed this previously. Kids in the game have always been of a pretty ambiguous age. There was no specific age to them, and so they would appear at schools but also at daycares, and their loot would range from things you'd find on a small, very young child all the way up to something you would only find on a teenager who was on the cusp of being an adult. In terms of miscellaneous things, this also adds a new plushie, which is a fox, so hooray, a fox plushie. There were also more snippets added to the game, so you can now find more new notes from children who are surviving the apocalypse. With that, however, I think this video draws to a close. Apologies again, I felt like I was out of breath this whole time I recorded. I don't know if that's like we're getting into springtime and it's pollen or something that's affecting me, but the whole recording I felt like I was rushing or out of breath, so apologies if that, hopefully that's not coming through in the video. Now regardless, everyone, thank you for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. I'll be back in a couple weeks with another episode, so I'll see you next time.